Hey, Rocky River Church. My name is Jimmy Britt. I'm the lead pastor here at Rocky River. Just want to say thank you for joining us today. Looking forward to a great time of worship. I'm really excited about today's message. And again, thank you for being here. We're going to worship now, and then I'll be back with today's message. God bless you.
Joyful and triumphant, oh come ye to Bethlehem. Come and behold him, born the King of angels. Oh come, let us adore him. Oh come, let us adore him. Oh come, let us adore him, Christ the Lord. Sing choirs of angels, sing in exaltation, sing all ye bright hosts of heaven above. Glory to God, all glory in the highest. Oh come, let us adore him. Oh come, let us adore him. Oh come, let us adore him, Christ. So come, let us sing a song declaring we belong to Jesus. He is all we need. Lift up a heart of praise. Sing now with voices raised to Jesus. Sing to the King. Oh yeah. Come, let us sing a song declaring we belong to Jesus. He is all we need. Lift up a heart of praise. Sing now with voices raised to Jesus. He is all we need. So come, let us sing a song declaring we belong to Jesus. Sing to the King. God rest ye merry gentlemen, let nothing you dismay. Remember Christ our Savior was born on Christmas Day to save us all from Satan's power when we were gone astray. Oh, tidings of comfort and joy, comfort and joy. Oh, tidings of comfort and joy. He has come for us, this Jesus. He's the blessed angel came, and unto certain shepherds brought tidings of the same, how that in Bethlehem was born the Son of God by name. Oh, tidings of comfort and joy, comfort and joy. Oh, tidings of comfort and joy. He has come for us, this Jesus. He's the hope for all mankind. He has come for us, the Messiah, born to give us life. All the angels sing hallelujah. He is Christ, is born. All the children sing hallelujah. He is Christ the Lord. He has come for us, this Jesus. He's the hope for all mankind. He has come for us, the Messiah, born to give us life. He is born to give us life. All the children sing hallelujah. He is Christ the Lord.
Well, once again, hello and welcome to Rocky River Church. If you're a first-time guest with us today or we just haven't had the chance to meet yet, my name is Jimmy and I'm the lead pastor here. And I like to say that whether you're a first-time guest, a long-time member, or somewhere in between, welcome. We're just really glad that you are here today. So if you have a Bible with you, open it up or turn it on and go to the book of Ruth, Ruth chapter 2. And then if you haven't already, be sure to download your message notes. You're going to want to have those as we go along today. And if you don't have message notes, listen, just make sure that you have a pen or a pencil, a piece of paper, some way for you to be able to take some notes today. And let me also add this. If you're a first-time guest with us today, we would love to send you a free copy of our book, Unshakable, Standing Strong When Things Go Wrong. And so to get your free copy, just be sure to fill out a connection card. You'll see that right. I think it's just to the right of your viewer. It's a blue button, maybe it says connection card. About halfway down through the connection card, you'll see a little box there that you can check that just lets us know that you're a first-time guest. And then we'll get you a copy of this book out in the mail this week. For as long as I can remember, one of the mainstays of Christmas shopping has been the Salvation Army. And you know what I'm talking about, right? The Salvation Army, they have their volunteers outside of department stores and malls and grocery stores. And the volunteers stand next to their trademark kettles, ringing a bell, and they're collecting funds to use to provide food and clothing for people who are in, great need. I was reading an article this week that said that some retailers and grocery stores no longer allow the Salvation Army to stand out in front of their stores collecting this money. And I thought, man, what a real shame this is. In fact, I sort of got upset about it, and I made a few calls to some local grocery stores in Harrisburg and places around town that I've seen having these Salvation Army volunteers in the past. And All the places I called, they still have that, so I was glad to hear that. But then the article also mentioned that there's a shortage of volunteer bell ringers this year, which I think is also a shame. So I decided this weekend that this upcoming week I'm going to call our local Salvation Army and find out what I need to do to volunteer as a bell ringer. And Rocky River Church, I'll pass that information along to you as well. And I say all this because I believe in the Salvation Army and the work that they do. And in fact, I want you to know that a portion of today's offerings, in fact, 10% will be shared with our local Salvation Army to help them provide food and clothing to people who are in need this Christmas. And so just please keep that in mind when you're giving your tithes and offerings today. I can think of two women who really needed the Salvation Army's services. But when they were alive, there was no Salvation Army. In fact, they lived about 1,000 years before the birth of Christ and that very first Christmas. And the women I'm talking about are Naomi and Ruth. Say those names with me, Naomi and Ruth. So Naomi is the mother-in-law, Ruth is the daughter-in-law. And we're tracking their story during this Christmas season. And their story is told, of course, in the Old Testament book of Ruth. And today we're going to pick up this story in Ruth chapter 2. Now, this is where Naomi and Ruth have returned home to Bethlehem, and they are in a very tough situation. Now, before we unpack Ruth chapter 2, let me remind you about where we are in the story, just sort of to catch you up a little bit. When the book of Ruth opens, we learn that there is a famine, say famine, in the nation of Israel, in the town of Bethlehem. Say Bethlehem. Very good. Bethlehem means the house of bread. So just think about it. This famine hit a place where there's usually plenty of food to eat. This is the bread basket, so to speak, of Judah. Now, in Israel, there are really two famines going on at the same time, okay? There's a physical famine where people are, they're starving, they're hurting for food, but then also there's a spiritual famine. And the physical famine in Israel is due to the fact that there is a spiritual famine in Israel. And what has brought on this spiritual famine is the fact that the people of God have turned away from God. And we know this from Ruth 1:1, where we get the context for the book of Ruth. This happened in the days when judges ruled Israel. And the days when judges ruled in Israel, this was after the death of Moses and Aaron, and before King Saul and the beginning of their monarchy. They're just ruled by this series of judges that are really like tribal chieftains, and they're leaders who are strong enough to sort of galvanize the people during a time of national crisis. But once that crisis is over, then the leader sort of falls away as well. And Judges 21:25 sort of summarizes the spiritual darkness that's going on in Israel. It says, in those days, Israel had no king, which means there's a leadership vacuum. All the people did whatever seemed right in their own eyes. These are dark days spiritually and otherwise, because God's people have turned away from him. They're doing whatever they think is right. They're not living according to God's law. They're not obeying God anymore. They're obeying themselves. Sound familiar? It should. So I want you to understand this. This famine in Israel was an act of God's judgment upon his people because of their sinful rebellion against him. Now, there was a family living in Bethlehem, dad, mom, and two sons. The dad is Elimelech. Naomi is the mom, and the sons are Mahlon and Chilion. Say those two names with me, Mahlon and Chilion. And as a family, I'm going to say as a family, but the reality is that dads, pretty much ruled the family. So it's mostly dad's decision. I'm not saying that Naomi or Mahlon and Chilion didn't have any say in it, but it's basically Elimelech's fateful decision to move his family from Bethlehem in Judea to Moab. So they're moving from Judah to Moab. Now here's the problem. Moab was a pagan place. The Moabites are cousins to the people of Israel, but they've also been longtime enemies of God's people. And God's hand was against them for a number of reasons, but one of the main reasons is that they offered child sacrifices to their pagan gods. So God's presence is not in Moab. So to move your family out of Judah and into Moab is to move your family away from God. And Moab is not the place where Elimelech's family belonged. But they moved there thinking that somehow their life would be better there. But again, I want you to understand that by moving to Moab, Elimelech took his family further away from God, and their lives got much worse. And I just want to stop here long enough to tell you that I see this happen all the time. I've seen it happen, my whole ministry. And very often it's dads who move their family away from God. Now, most of the time, maybe even all of the time, I don't know for sure, but I would say at least most of the time, the dad isn't thinking that. Whether he's a part of the church or he's not a part of the church, he's not thinking, okay, what I want to do is I want to separate my family from God. That's not it. Usually it's much more subtle than that. It's getting the family involved in something that will take his family away from church, and it seems to be innocent enough. It's usually things that you can make a pretty good argument for doing. It could be things like sports. I can't tell you how many times in my ministry I've seen families pulled away from the church because of sports. And sometimes, it's okay, especially now that, we're a church, an in-person church, but an online church. We have a number of families in our church that they play seasonal ball. And so when they're away, they're playing baseball games. They have the whole family sitting there watching the service online, and they're participating that way. But I've also seen many times where that one step out of the church turns into many steps that lead that family away from God. Let me tell you something. It's never God's will for you to make a decision in your family. And I'm talking to moms and dads. It's never God's will for you to make decisions and make moves that will move your family further away from God rather than closer to God. But they go to Moab. Well, not long after they arrived in Moab, Elimelech, the dad, the husband, he died. Well, you kind of think, after the death of the dad, maybe they'll go home, because they had probably only intended to go there for just a while. They're kind of sojourners. But then they settle in. And Mahlon and Chilion, they marry Moabite women, which shows they're settled in. They're not planning on returning to Judah. And after they had stayed in Moab another 10 years, listen, both of Naomi's sons died. And I'll tell you that one of the saddest images, at least to me, in the entire Bible is just imagining these three women, grieving, heartbroken, widowed women all alone in this Moabite graveyard with very few options. And you can't imagine this like it's the 21st century. And so, this women are empowered to do things. So women can go back to school, or, there are a number of different options, but not if you're living in this day, not if you're living in this time, not 1000 BC. In those days, you needed a man to take care of you, to give you security. They don't have a lot of options. Well, Naomi decided to go back home to God's people and to God's presence. Now, you need to understand, she's not happy about this. Naomi, as we saw last week, she was very bitter about how life had turned out. When she returned to Bethlehem, she told the people there, I left Bethlehem full and I'm returning empty. But at this point in her life, she thought it was really all that she could do. So Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth packed up and started toward Bethlehem. Now, along the way, Naomi tried to convince her daughters to return to their own homes. Go back to your mother and your father. She said, go back to your own gods. I'm an old woman. I can't start my life over. I'm bitter. God's hand is against me. But you're young enough that maybe you can find security in finding another husband. You still have a life before you. My life is over. That's really what she's saying. And at first, both of these girls said no. But after a little more conversation, Orpah took Naomi's advice and returned back to her home, back to her parents, and back to her own gods. But Ruth, who I believe had a conversion experience. I believe that she converted to Naomi's God, the true and living God of the Bible. She insisted on staying with Naomi. Naomi tried again pretty hard to convince her to return home, but Ruth was adamant she wasn't going home, that she said, your people will be my people, your God will be my God. Where you die, I'm gonna die there, and may God punish me if I don't keep that oath to you. So Naomi doesn't say anything else to her. When Ruth 1 ends, Naomi and Ruth are back in Bethlehem, and they're hungry, bankrupt, homeless, and widowed. Okay, are you getting the picture? Because it's a dark one. Now, I think I told you guys last week that the book of Ruth, it's narrative history. So it's a story that really happened. It's a love story that happened, and we have a narrator that's telling us the story. And the last thing he says in Ruth chapter 1 is that it's late spring at the beginning of the barley harvest, which is sometime in late April or early May. Okay, I promise you, we're going to get into Ruth 2 in just a moment. But I want to mention that probably the easiest way to preach or teach the book of Ruth is to teach it all at one time. All 4 chapters, all 85 verses, all at once. Because again, it's narrative history, so this thing doesn't really tie up until the end. But we're not at the end. We're not at the beginning, but we're headed into halfway of the story. So that makes it a little bit challenging because we're breaking this book up into 4 different Sundays. So we're looking at 1 chapter each week, but we can't tie everything up together. So here's what I want to do. What I want to do today is help you see how God cares for people in need. Okay? I want to help you see how God cares for people in need. And I hope that something in today's message will help you experience Christmas in a different way this year, and maybe even change how you think about and experience Christmas for the rest of your life. And I hope it'll be bigger than just one season of the year. I hope that you'll see how God cares for people, how he cares for people in need, and that he uses people like you and me and Ruth to meet those needs. All right, you still with me? Okay, let's get started unpacking Ruth chapter 2, starting in verse 1. Now there was a wealthy and influential man in Bethlehem named Boaz, which is just a great name, isn't it? Boaz. Say Boaz. Boaz. He was a relative of Naomi's husband, Elimelech. So before the narrator jumps into the action here in chapter 2, he introduces us to a new character, Boaz, who is going to be just such an important character for the rest of the story. You're going to see today that Boaz he's a good man, and he's a godly man. The words that are used to describe him as a wealthy and influential man is the same Hebrew words that mean things like strength, strong warrior, mighty, good, and kind. So I want you to kind of get the picture here. Boaz is as close to a knight in shining armor as a man can get. Parents, this is the kind of man that you want your sons to grow up and be like. It's the kind of man that you want your daughters to bring home and announce that you're getting married. I mean, he's just a great guy. And again, you're going to see that, some of it today and certainly over the next couple of weeks. Now, the most important thing that you need to know about Boaz, at least up to this point, and again, this sort of follows through the rest of the story, and that is that Boaz is from the family of Ruth's father-in-law, Elimelech. Okay? This means that he could be, it remains to be seen, unless you read chapters 3 and 4, but this could be the very lifeline that Naomi and Ruth desperately need. But again, we'll just have to see. One day, Ruth, the Moabite, and you'll notice in this chapter that the narrator reminds us several times. In fact, he has Ruth do it, at least once. He's going to remind us that she's a Moabite, that she is a foreigner, that she's an outsider. And that's a reminder that the things that happen in her life in Bethlehem are extraordinary. One day, Ruth, the Moabite, said to Naomi, "Let me go out into the harvest fields to pick up the stalks of grain left behind by anyone who is kind enough to let me do it." Now here's what she's talking about. And this is the first place in the story that we see that God cares about people who are in need. Ruth is talking about gleaning. God gave his people, the children of Israel, he gave them a command in Leviticus 19, verses 9 and 10. It's in a couple of other places too, but primarily Leviticus 19, verses 9 and 10. And the command was this, that if you own a field, you could go out and harvest the field, but you couldn't go to the corners of the field, and you could not go back and harvest more than once the edges of the field. The produce, whether it's grapes or olives, in this case it's barley. In the summer it's going to be wheat. In this case, You had to leave the barley in the corners and on the edges so that poor people who are living in Bethlehem or wherever they're living in Judah, they could go there and glean what has been left behind so that they'll have something to eat. Basically, this is God's welfare system. This is God looking out for the poor and needy. But I want to tell you, it's a great system. It's great for a couple of different reasons. Number one, the people who own the fields, they are reminded that ultimately God owns the fields. I mean, he's the creator, right? I mean, he created it, he owns it. He's also the Lord of the harvest. And so as Lord of the harvest and the true owner and creator of those fields, he has the right to say what happens with the harvest that comes away from them. But also to those who are poor and foreigners or just people traveling through, it lets them know that God cares about them, but they're not just receiving a handout. They have to go into the field and glean it. So they get to keep some of their own dignity. Yes, they're poor. Yes, they are needy. Yes, there are problems there, but they have the dignity of going there and putting in the effort to glean the food for themselves. You see how this works out? So it really works out well for everyone, but it shows that God cares about them. Naomi replied, "All right, my daughter, go ahead." Very short response. And you can tell in this short response that she's still bitter. Because let me tell you something. What Ruth is about to go and do out in these fields, to go out and glean as a woman, but as a foreigner, as an immigrant, it's very dangerous. A woman who did not have, let's just say a Judean woman, who didn't have a husband, a father, or a brother who could protect her or go after someone for retribution. She was extremely vulnerable to being physically assaulted and harassed and, sexually abused. And Naomi doesn't say anything like, "Hey, be careful, honey." She doesn't offer a prayer, no warnings, no words of encouragement. So you can tell that she's still living in her bitterness and maybe some depression as well. So Ruth went out to gather grain behind the harvesters. And as it happened, she found herself working in a field that belonged to Boaz, the relative of her father-in-law, Elimelech. Okay, I mentioned earlier that the best way to talk through and teach this story is to do it all at once. But again, we can't do that. This is one of those places, though, where it would be helpful. Because if we read the first 20 or so verses in chapter 1 and then just went straight through reading this story as a narrative story, we would understand that this phrase, "as it happened, she found herself working in a field that belonged to Boaz," we would understand that's hyperbole. It's not meant to be understood literally, because there's no way to read the story that comes before this and not see that God's hand is all over Ruth and Naomi's lives. That God is at work, that God has a plan. So when you read this, don't read this as though it's an accident. This is Hebrew humor. This is the narrator saying like, "Yeah, right. And she just ended up in a field that just happened to belong to Boaz. Yeah, right." Do you get the point? This is a big deal. I think it's also why the narrator keeps reminding us that Ruth is a foreigner. She's a Moabite. These fields are just outside of town, and they are a patchwork of fields. And so you might have a guy that owns 5 acres here, and he might own 2 acres a mile away, and then he might have another 10 acres somewhere else. And there's no fences, there are no signs with family names. There's no way for Ruth to know this field belongs to a relative of her dead father-in-law, Elimelech. If you're taking notes, there are just a couple of things that you ought to jot down here. One is, remember that God has a sovereign plan. God has a sovereign plan, and he's working that plan. He's working that plan for his own purposes, and you can see it happening right here. You know, when it comes to Christmas and it comes to thinking about God working and being at work in the world, it's incredible to think about the miracle of the virgin birth. And you think about the angel Gabriel coming to Mary and making that announcement, and it's God intervening in history in like a show-stopping kind of moment. And those moments are amazing. I'm not trying to downplay that at all, but let me tell you what is also amazing. It is also amazing when you see God's hand at work in the ordinary, everyday situations of life. And you see God working in the lives of regular, everyday, ordinary people. In fact, you could make the argument that Ruth was less than ordinary. If you're just thinking about her life and how she would fit into the social categories in life, she's at the bottom of the barrel. And here is God working in her life. So remember that God has a sovereign plan, that God is at work in the world. And then I would also say, as God's people, we should respond to God's plan by faith. Let me tell you, that's exactly what Ruth does here. She responds to God's plan and his word by faith. Think about this. She's a new convert, so she hasn't been following God that long, but she knows about the gleaning law. And she trusts God. She doesn't know exactly where she's going to go. Now, she knows the direction of the fields. She has nowhere to go. Maybe she's just following the line. She doesn't know which field to pick. But right now, she's not trusting someone like Boaz. She's trusting God. She's trusting that God has a plan and that God will lead her and guide her to the place where he can provide for her needs. Let's move on a little further. While she was there, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you," he said. "The Lord bless you," the harvesters replied, which is really interesting. You know, I've worked a number of different jobs in my lifetime, but I've never worked in a place where the boss walked in and said, "The Lord be with you," and all the employees or the workers said back to the boss, "The Lord bless you." I mean, I work in a church, for goodness sakes, and when I walk in the mornings, I don't say shalom or greetings in the name of the Lord or the Lord be with you. And, you know, the rest of the staff doesn't respond back by saying, "And the Lord bless you." What this does is it just points to the fact that, again, Boaz is a good man. He's a godly man. And he has this reputation for being a godly man. And in his place of business, he's created a culture where God is honored. And it shows that he's a caring person, which is important, as you'll see in a few minutes when he starts to look out for Ruth. But he's a caring person, and he wants what's best. And what's best for his people is the blessing of God. He wants his people to experience the blessings of God. Now, it's no coincidence that Ruth happens to be there when Boaz comes out to check things out, to look over the fields, just to see how the work is going. Verse 5, then Boaz asked his foreman, who is that young woman over there? Who does she belong to? So Boaz would have done the hiring. He knew he didn't hire her, so she's not one of his workers. She's gleaning, and he doesn't recognize her. So I think he's legitimately asking, who is she? Who does she belong to? That means, does she have a husband? Does she have a father? Does she have a family? Is she a slave? But I think also, Boaz is a bachelor. We'll learn that later. And I think what he wants to know is Ruth marriable? I can't tell you why. Maybe this is just my own opinion, but I have a feeling that Ruth was a good-looking lady. And I think she caught the eye of Boaz. Well, the foreman responds, verse 6. He replied, she's a young woman from Moab, the very young woman from Moab who came back with Naomi. Now, when he says this probably jogs something, in Boaz's mind. Maybe Boaz was even thinking, hey, I wonder if that's the Moabite. There's been some talk, you'll see this in a little bit later, in just a few verses. There's been some talk about her. So, she's the one, you've heard about her. She came back with Naomi. And then he offers some more information because he's impressed with Ruth. She asked me this morning if she could gather grain behind the harvesters. She's been hard at work ever since, except for a few minutes rest in the shelter. This foreman's impressed with her. It's like he's saying she's here to glean, but she's one of the hardest working people out here. I know you didn't ask for that, but I'm telling you that. This is who she is. She's the Moabite who came home from Naomi, and boy, is she a worker. Boaz went over to Ruth and said to her, listen, my daughter. Whoa. He calls her my daughter. That may be something to clue us in to what's going to be coming down the road, but it could also be interpreted, as young lady, young woman. He said, stay right here with us when you gather grain. Don't go to any of the other fields. Stay right behind the young women working in my field. See which part of the field they are harvesting, and then follow them. And by the way, I have warned the young men not to treat you roughly. And when you're thirsty, help yourself to the water they have drawn from the well. So God cares about people in need. God has a plan for people who are in need. And I want you to see that God works through people to meet those needs. He works through specific people. He's working through Ruth to take care of Naomi's needs. You'll see that more as we unpack this chapter further. But here he's using Boaz to take care of the needs of Ruth. And so he's a guy who's willing, are you? He's willing to help this woman out in her time of need. And not only is he willing to do the minimum, see, he's not just living to the letter of the law that says he has to make room for people like Ruth to come in and glean. He's going the extra mile. I think God uses people like Boaz, people who are willing to not just do the minimum, but people who are willing to go the extra mile. And I love Ruth. I love her attitude. I love her humility. I love the fact that she is an immigrant, and she realizes that she doesn't have any sort of claim on a field or a family. And she doesn't come in, holding a section of Leviticus 19, 9 through 10 that says, hey, I have the right to be here to glean. Instead, when she gets to the field, she asks for permission. And then here's her response in verse 10 to Boaz. Ruth fell at his feet and thanked him warmly. What have I done to deserve such kindness? She asked. I'm only a foreigner. Not to make this something political, but, the United States, we Americans, we're a nation of immigrants. And I think we realize that. And I think that most Americans, because we know we're a nation of immigrants, we don't mind immigration. We just like it done respectfully. We don't necessarily want someone just coming in acting like they have a right to come in and take something they haven't worked for or earned. I think one of the things that makes Ruth so attractive is that she's humble and she's thankful. She just wants the opportunity. Yes, I know, Boaz replied, but I also know about everything that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. I've heard how you left your father and your mother and your own land to live here among complete strangers. And then he blesses her. He says, may the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, reward you fully for what you have done. You know what he recognizes in Ruth? That she is a person who's made sacrifices. Boaz made some sacrifices, but he made some sacrifices, generous sacrifices even, out of his abundance. He could afford it. Ruth made some sacrifices, but it wasn't out of money. She gave, think about this. Ruth gave up, as far as she knew, she gave up her future. I mean, there was Naomi, they're on this road, back to Bethlehem, and Naomi's talking to Orpah and Ruth, and she's trying to convince them, hey, the best thing for you to do is go back to your own homes, your own gods, your parents, maybe you can start life over. I'm just this bitter, old, broken woman going home to nothing. I have no life and no future. And Naomi could have Ruth could have looked at Naomi and said, oh, lady, you're right. I'm not going to go and live with you in Bethlehem and be miserable from now on. I'm going to go back and do my own thing. As far as Ruth knows, she is sacrificing her own future. And yes, the people in Bethlehem are talking about the Moabite woman, this foreigner, this woman who is from God's garbage can. But they're also talking about how good she's treated one of their own daughters, one of their own sisters, Naomi. She said, I hope I continue to please you, sir, she replied. You've comforted me by speaking so kindly to me, even though I'm not one of your workers. I think two of the most important words, maybe in this whole chapter, are those two words, I hope. Sometimes when you're thinking about helping people who are in need, don't just think about people who need food and clothing, or maybe shelter, or some help paying a bill. Sometimes what people need is kindness. Someone to talk to them. Someone who can give them some comfort. And sometimes through the act of kindness, through just what you say or how you treat people, can give them the hope to keep going forward. The hope to keep trying. See, there's more than one way to help someone. And there are more needs than just physical needs. And Boaz certainly has taken care of her physical needs, but he's also paying attention to her emotional needs. Verse 14, some time goes by. Now we get to a meal. I think this meal time is probably lunchtime. At mealtime, Boaz called to her, come over here and help yourself to some food. You can dip your bread in the sour wine. I think this like going to the macaroni grill. They bring out some bread and they have some, oil and vinegar that you can mix there at your table. And I don't know if in Italy, they talk about sopping that up with their piece of bread, but that's the way we would talk about here in the South. And so that's what's going on. So she sat with his harvesters, and Boaz gave her some roasted grain to eat. She ate all she wanted and still had some left over. One of the needs that you ought to be looking for in people this Christmas is the need for connection. Again, think about Ruth's life. Think about what's going on for her. She's a foreigner. She's in Bethlehem. She is living with a woman who, it must be horrible at this point to live with Naomi. She's bitter. She'll barely speak. And so you know that there has to be times for Ruth when she's just lonely. She needs someone to help her get connected. And that's what Boaz does. Boaz sees her sitting off alone, and he invites her over to have a meal with his harvesters. He gave her connection. You know, sometimes the people around you, that's what they need from you. You know, they're sitting at the lunch table alone. They probably, or they may even look like they're enjoying just being there alone, and maybe they are. But maybe they're just, on the inside, they're just dying for someone to invite them over to their table. Someone who can give them connection, someone they can have a relationship with. When Ruth went back again to work, Boaz ordered his young men, let her gather grain right among the sheaves without stopping her. This means let her go over to where we're stacking all these sheaves up and gather from there, and pull out some of the heads of barley from the bundles and drop them on purpose for her. And then he says, let her pick them up and don't give her a hard time. So Ruth gathered barley there all day. And when she beat out the grain that evening, it filled an entire basket, which means that she had enough to take home that's probably going to feed her beyond a few days. It's probably going to last her a couple of weeks. She carried it back into town and showed it to her mother-in-law. Ruth also gave her the roasted grain that was left over from her meal. So she's brought home the doggy bag from lunch. Where did you get all this grain today? Naomi asked. Where did you work? And then she says the nicest words we've heard come out of Naomi's mouth up to this point. She said, may the Lord bless the one who helped you. So Ruth told her mother-in-law about the man whose field she had worked. She said, the man I worked with today is named Boaz. And she said, may the Lord bless him. Naomi told her daughter-in-law. And then she said, he is showing his kindness to us as well as to your dead husband. That man is one of our closest relatives, one of our family redeemers, which is a mouthful because what Naomi is seeing now. See, Boaz has given Ruth hope. Ruth has brought the hope home to Naomi. And now there's a little bit of pep in Naomi's step. Now she can see that maybe God's hand is not against them. She said, good. Do as he said, my daughter. Stay with his young women right through the harvest. You might be harassed in other fields, but you'll be safe with him. She can see God's hand at work in their lives. So Ruth worked alongside the women in Boaz's fields and gathered grain with them until the end of the barley harvest. Then she continued working with them, which means now she's not just gleaning, but now she's actually getting a paycheck. She's one of the workers. At the end of the day or the end of the week, she's receiving some money. And all the while, she lived with her mother-in-law, which means that she's kept her loyal love promise to her mother-in-law. And you kind of wonder if she's going to, right? Because here's Ruth. She's able to glean. She's doing pretty good for herself. She's not only able to take some food home with her at the end of the day, so that need is met. She's plugged in, she's connected, socially to other people, and now she's got some coin in her pocket, and maybe she's thinking, hey, you know what? I'll just go get a place of my own. Nope. She stays true to her word. Here's how I want to end today. As God's people, we've experienced His grace. So what are we going to do about it? Knowing that God uses people to meet the needs of those in need, how are you going to let God use you? How are you going to let God use you to share His love and kindness with others? Ruth had faith to believe that God had a plan, that God would keep His word and meet her needs. And based on that trust, she stepped out in faith. Will you? Are you going to do the minimum? Because to be honest with you, the minimum is more than most people do. Or are you going to go the extra mile? What are you going to sacrifice this Christmas for someone else? Is it just going to be about you? Is it just going to be about your family of 2 or 3 or 4 or whatever? Who are you going to love unconditionally? Who are you going to be loyal to? Who are you going to serve? Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, thank you for your word. Thank you for the fact that we can know you have a plan for the world, a plan for us. And you're working this plan in a way that accomplishes your purposes. I just pray that you would open our eyes to needs around us, that we, through your leadership, through your guidance, through your help, through your provision, can help to meet them. And by doing this, let us be able to think about and experience Christmas like we never have before. In Jesus' name, amen.